thank you, Chris, and thank you to the whole Reforge team for helping set this up. My name is Kyle Block. I'm the head of research at Gradient Metrics. I'm joining you today from sunny, very rarely so, Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And so very, very grateful to have your attention today to learn about how you can design your products with an understanding of what it is that your customers actually want your product to do for them. So we're going to learn a little bit over the next 30 minutes about some methodologies that we are very comfortable with and love bringing to the world to help startups and companies and organizations of all kinds and sizes build with precision. And just a little bit of background so you kind of know the type of orientation that I'm bringing to the discussion today is I'm the head of research and have the great fortune of being the head of research at Gradient, which is a quantitative research or decision science partner. And what gets me out of bed in the morning is the opportunity and fulfillment to help companies and organizations make better decisions and make them with quantitative precision. And we do this through custom survey research and very advanced statistical models. So we're not really like a standard market research firm where you just get a bunch of spreadsheets and you're kind of like scratching your head and not sure how to make sense of it. We're a little more toward the analytics sides where we apply a lot of modeling to help extract the phenomenon or drivers of behavior that really do cause consumers to make decisions. So we're a bit of a liberal arts kind of group. We love the substance. We love getting into the heads of your consumers and the sectors and their environment. And we also are data scientists, and we love modeling and coding and interpreting the results and finding that really clear kind of decision that needs to be made based on the evidence that we have found through some custom research together. And this is me. If you want my email address, it's here, easy, kyle@gradientmetrics.com. You'll see this again at the end of our time together, but just a real treat to be with you today. And what I imagine you're all here to learn about is what are some methods that are available and not uncommon to really figure out what your customers want you to build. And truthfully, Gradient exists because a lot of brands and a lot of businesses think they know what their customers want them to build. They build them, they don't work. And they come calling to me and they say, gee, I'm not sure what happened here. And it happens all the time. It's still a big surprise to me. But the beauty is you don't need to always guess. You don't always need to rely on your intuition to try to evaluate what your customers want and then design your roadmap against that. So today we're going to have a pretty packed 45-minute session where I'm going to enumerate some of the other product research methodologies that are common and good, and I'll add a little more clarity on some of the pros and cons of each of them. And then I want to focus the bulk of our time together on what we would consider the gold standard of product research or product roadmap research, which is going to be very focused on trade-off experiments. You're going to learn a lot more about that in a few minutes. And then I am very, very curious to hear what kinds of product design questions and or other methodologies you may have used to inform your own roadmap. So we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A for that. But I want to start with posing perhaps a dramatic sounding question, but one that we ask a lot of our partners all the time, which is, what is the cost of building the wrong product features? This could be a reality where maybe you build what seem like the right product features, right? A number of users goes up, you're seeing a lot of activity, your growth is in the positive direction, but there's potentially still a cost in building the wrong features, because what if that uptake could have been even steeper? or what if that growth trajectory could have been even steeper? That cost could potentially be very significant. What's more of the positive spin on this, yes, dramatic question? And then there's the more negative side, which is you may just be building the wrong thing with the wrong features, or you've emphasized an investment in building features that your customers maybe would like to have, but don't actually need to have. And that is going to affect your longer term uptake and relationship with those customers. So we're here to help reduce the cost significantly of building any product by knowing what it is that your customers expect and demand from your product. And again, this question doesn't need to be answered solely through intuition or kind of scratching your head. There are quantitative and qualitative ways to inform what your roadmap should look like and what features you should focus your engineering and development investments in. And just to be very clear, like this is, for many of you, the hardest question you're going to answer. And for that reason, would recommend investing in some high quality, rigorous product roadmap research to take a large majority of that guesswork. So there are, in my perspective, generally kind of three broad categories of product research. And I really don't think there is a wrong approach. The only one being not doing any product research. I think that's a risky endeavor. So as long as you're doing something to understand what it is that your consumers, either current or prospective, desire from your brand via its products, you're heading in the right direction. But within that, there is a wide spectrum of rigor and generalizability and confidence that you can draw upon from each of these three broad categories. So what is an absolutely good method is some qualitative listening. And I'd like to thank those of you who are here who are very savvy, curious, builders and startup owners. Do this all the time. It's in your nature. And you're going to hear things from customers' perspective and current that you're like, we need to solve for that. That is a really, really valuable insight. What qualitative listening, however, can't give you is a measure of generalizability. In other words, you can't say with confidence that all of your customers demand this, or a significant portion of your customers expect this, or that the feature that you build actually isn't that valuable. You're not able to claim that just from qualitative listening. And then the other trade-off, I suppose, with qualitative listening is you're getting one person's perspective, and they may not necessarily, this is human nature, be aware of what it is that's driving their preference. In other words, there is plenty of research suggesting that our own stated preference, what we say we really want and desire, doesn't always actually align with our revealed preference. There's things happening on our decision-making realm that we're just unaware of, but they're happening and they're driving our behaviors. And so to qualitatively convey that is a pretty high, if not rare, expectation. So that's the qualitative listening. On the quantitative concept testing, this is kind of a good middle ground. Some of you may have, refer to this as A/B testing, where you are getting a generalizable read on what your customers want. And you can kind of through an A/B, simulate a little bit of a trade-off, but you're not able to attribute the specific driver of that preference to other than just the kind of concept as a whole. And then what I really want to focus on, we're going to do a double click later, are what we would consider to be the gold standard of product research, which are trade-off experiments. So these offer the benefit of being generalizable, and you can directly attribute the drivers of preference to any one element or attribute of your product. So we'll just summarize these, and then we'll get into the trade-off experiment, double click. But the beauty of listening to your customers is you hear it right from them. You hear the emotions. They can literally show you what's working, what's not. That is really, really valuable. But again, the cons are it's not generalizable. You're going to be reflected in those results, some type of bias, and that could be, again, known or unknown. And it is very time consuming to conduct. And a lot of teams do this on their own. It's really valuable, and I think you should do it. But on a large scale, it's really hard to do quickly and without kind of consuming the full bandwidth of your entire product team. On the quantitative concept testing tier, that kind of middle ground, the beauty of it is because it's quantitative, and if you've got a large enough sample size, you can claim with confidence that what you're finding is generalizable to your audience or to a large proportion of it. And you can tackle a lot of additional strategy questions at the same time as doing your product research. So at the same time where you're evaluating what maybe two different concept or product preferences are, you can also add additional variables that help you understand who your audience is. What do they like? Who are they? What is their context? You can ask some questions about brand preferences and affinity for perhaps other competitors. So that's a really efficient way to learn a lot of things about your product, about your audience, and about your brand. But there are some cons to quantitative concept testing, which principally when we're talking about product preferences, with a simple A/B test, you can't say definitively what it is about the concept that is ultimately driving preference. You can say this concept, A, is preferred much more than B. There's certainly value in that. But if you're trying to design a roadmap and you've got limited resources, it might be helpful to know what is it about A that is actually valuable there. And we'll explain more why trade-off experiments are able to do exactly that. And then when you do want to measure questions related to pricing, having kind of a simple A/B test introduces very large margins of error. So it's not a very precise way to answer questions related to pricing. And then we have the gold standard, the trade-off experiments. Some of you may have heard of them as discrete choice experiments also. These are survey-based, just like the quantitative concept testing. These are survey-based experiments that get as close as possible in a survey to emulating the real-life decision-making environment that consumers face. And inherent in all of that is making trade-offs. Do I want this milk or that milk? Do I want this milk at that price? Do I want that yogurt with that color, with that kind of low-fat feature? These are all decisions that we as consumers have to make, and a conjoint or trade-off experiment gets as close as possible to emulating those trade-offs. And one of the biggest benefits, therefore, is that with a trade-off experiment, you can identify very precisely what it is about the product, its features, its attributes, or alternatives you're contemplating that drive the preference or drive the market share. So it's a very precise and nimble methodology. And it can also tell you what the optimal combination of product features are in the world where maybe you're not sure if a feature is even worth building at all. A trade-off experiment can tell you which features or attributes maybe could just be ignored or shelved for a later iteration. And they also can use a lot of different types of stimulus. So the ones we'll see today are mainly text-based, but you could absolutely include visuals, audio, visual, branding. All of that can be evaluated in a trade-off experiment. However, there are trade-offs to trade-off experiments. And a few of them they're not exactly simple, at least relative to some of the other product research methods I spoke about earlier. They're complex. There are some great off-the-shelf tools that try to remove some of the complexity there, but it is just a more advanced methodology. So it does require an above average familiarity with quantitative data and likely modeling. And they're therefore time consuming and relatively expensive to conduct, but they give you an immense amount of precision. The hope being then that that investment pays off very, very quickly in that you've built a product that it is known that your customers actually want. So we're going to get to know our friend, the trade-off experiment, the gold standard here. So just to make the case, if it's needed, of why trade-off experiments are considered the gold standard of product research is, again, we want to measure revealed preferences rather than stated preferences, because they are still decisions that are being made, whether or not they're stated or revealed. The most important is that we capture the actual behavior, and trade-off experiments are much more likely to reveal that, because regular survey questions where you're directly asking somebody kind of force you to think in a like very simple binary, whereas in a trade-off experiment, you're making a lot of different choices, and the model extracts what is actually driving that, rather than you as an individual user having to claim, I'm making this decision because of X feature or Y price. And then again, the real benefit to this is they're generalizable. And so you can say with confidence that these preferences or the pricing sensitivity that we're identifying is in fact true and accurate and generalizable for our customers or our prospective customers. So I'm going to focus the majority of our time together on one of the two types of trade-off experiments, but I want to just make sure you have an elementary understanding of both of them. One is called a MaxDiff, or maximum difference experiment, and it's relatively simpler than the Conjoint experiment in that the MaxDiff will give you a rank order measure of the product features that your customers prefer, and the order of magnitude or measure of size for each of those preferences. What it cannot do, though, is include any other kind of measures associated with that. So you can't measure cost, and you can't measure combination of other features. This just gives you a very clean and helpful rank order and measure of size. A conjoint also is kind of a combination of considered jointly, is a relatively more complex methodology, but it's one that really allows you to parse apart all of the different product features that you're either considering building or have built, and identify which among them and which combination of them are going to generate the most interest. And because of the kind of multiple elements inherent in a conjoint, you can include measures of price. So this is where it becomes really, really valuable to see in terms of price rather than just preference, what your customers are actually after. And the difference between the two is simply in the scope of features that are under evaluation. So if your question is, I've got 10 features, I don't know which 10 of them I should invest in, if any of them, then a MaxDiff is going to give you the clarity you're after. If you've got, let's say, 5 attributes, and within each attribute, a couple different options for each one, and you're not sure what the ideal combination is, then a conjoint is going to be the appropriate methodology to answer that kind of question. So really quickly, MaxDiff, and then we'll focus the rest of our time on conjoint. Exactly as I was mentioning, let's just assume you've got 10 different features here, and you're just not sure which ones are worth investing in. Then you're going to want to pursue a MaxDiff. So it's a survey-based method, and you'll field it to your kind of a plausible universe of potential or current customers, and it'll reveal something like this. So on the left, we have an example, a very simple example of what the respondent is reacting to. So they're going to answer the question, which of these 5 attributes is the most and least important to you? And they'll select the most, and they'll select the least. And then they're going to do this 8 to 12 times, depending on how many attributes are being tested. And then we do a lot of very complicated math. And then it outputs, and this is just an example, that rank order and measure of magnitude of preference for all of the features that you're considering. And so by going through this multiple times, the model is able to essentially back out what is driving preference. So this is a MaxDiff. And it's not at all unrelated to its more complicated family member here, the conjoint. And so here's a very simple example, then we're going to go into a bit more of a complex one. But again, a conjoint is an appropriate product research method when you've got a lot of different attributes. So in this example, that could be data backup, notifications, and integrations, and you're not sure of two things. One, which attributes, data backup, notifications, integrations, are worth investing in, and within those attributes, which option is going to be most preferred. So the conjoint clarifies both of those. And the other very nice benefit of a conjoint analysis is, and I'll show you an example, it allows you to also simulate different combinations of product features. If, for example, like the cost to build perhaps the ideal is just too high and you don't have that kind of capital, then we can see what the market share and interest would be like for maybe the second best option. So it's a very nimble methodology. So similar to that very simple MaxDiff, this is a quick example, but it shows you exactly what attribute and the extent to which that they drive your preference. And the respondents, you'll see a more involved example of this shortly, make a trade-off, and they'll see two options, which is on the left here. They'll pick the one that they most prefer. They'll go through this about 8 to 12 times. And then the model, the very hard math, this cute little icon, will tell us very clearly what is driving preference. So let's simulate, we're all about simulating results here, a scenario where a conjoint is going to save the day. So imagine you're the vice president of a really nicely named a product called Tax Me More Enterprise. And you're a legacy brand, you've been around a long time, and the world is quickly changing around you. And you don't know what product features you need to invest in. You've got a meeting with your CEO, you're pretty sure the product needs some changes, and you don't know how many engineering dollars you really need to ask for. So you could listen to your intuition, do a little qualitative listening, and make a case to your CEO based off of that. Or you could design a conjoint and develop a lot more precision with understanding which exact features your customers want and are willing to pay for from your brand. So let's bring this to life. So there's two essential elements to a conjoint. One is the attributes. These are the kind of higher order product elements that you know your product probably does need to have, and you want to assess how essential each of these broader product elements are in contributing to driving preference share. So for this very hypothetical example, the VP of product has decided that he wants to test 6 different attributes: error checking, multi-platform access, the ability to track refunds. He thinks, based on some research he's done and existing user data, that there's value in these, but he doesn't really know relatively how much. So we first need to define the attributes. Those are the broader order, higher order product elements. And then nested within each of those attributes are what we call levels. These are the options or the different alternatives within each attribute that are under consideration. And these can be completely hypothetical. They could be existing. There's no wrong answer there. But the beauty is you can test a high number of both attributes and levels which is you're unable to do in that kind of quantitative concept testing middle tier that I mentioned earlier. So in this case, the VP of product is hearing from existing customers like, you really need to have multi-platform access to SAP in there. But some of his customers are also qualitatively telling him, nope, QuickBooks is all we need. He doesn't know with precision what the value of each of those options is. So a conjoint is the perfect environment to test that. And it's a similar story with all of these attributes and levels. He thinks they're all valuable, but isn't really sure and doesn't know the relative value of each of them. So we are going to run a conjoint together to bring some clarity to identify the attributes and the levels within them that are actually driving customer preference. And we've designed a survey. We're fielding it to a representative sample of current and prospective customers, which does require some sampling science in it, but that's the relatively easy part here. And this is just a really short screenshot of what the respondent experience could look like for just the conjoint portion, where they're going to see two side-by-side options. They're going to select the one that they prefer the most, and then it'll randomly auto-populate with another random set of levels, and they'll have to evaluate again. Gee, which of these do I actually prefer? How important is federal? And this is the thought process that every respondent goes through. Whether or not they know it is a little bit irrelevant. And then having done this 8 to 12 times, we get an immense amount of data that we can then run models to estimate which of these attributes and levels are actually driving preference. And this is all without the consumer stating what they prefer. I hope you can kind of see now, it's all revealed. So we've done a lot of work designing that kind of potential attribute map. We've fielded the survey, we've collected the data, we've run the analyses, estimated the models. What does it tell us? What kind of decisions can we make from a conjoint experiment like this? So first, we get a measure of attribute importance. So again, these are the higher order product elements. And this is a very hypothetical example. It turns out that having a refund tracking feature in this tax software is absolutely essential to having a viable product, in that it contributes roughly 45% of the overall drive to consider purchasing this product. So without having the refund tracking feature, you don't really have a viable product. It's going to be a lot less valuable than if it had one. And the other important decision here is that it turns out there's a couple features that actually don't contribute that much to consumers' preference share. And these are the audit assistance and error tracking, that they're probably related. And this is of course normal, you've got finite engineering funds to work with, and it's going to cost a lot to develop an error checking and or audit assistance feature. For your initial build or your initial refresh, these two may not actually be worth building because they contribute relatively little to the overall preference share. So that's attribute importance. And then we double click into each of those attributes to identify which levels within the attribute are most preferred. So these are ordered by attribute in order of attribute importance. So the very, very clear implications here are, we already know refund tracking is important, and this just confirms that it is, contributes an immense, it's an immense driver to overall product preference. Price is, of course, always important, sometimes the most, sometimes not. And this tells us kind of where the relative willingness to pay is. There's a lot more complexity when there's a price variable involved that isn't contemplated in today's discussion, but we do we're using price. So there's a real actual trade-off here. So this does hold some fidelity to real world thinking. And then it tells us some other important things around the other features that customers want. So in this particular case, of course, federal is essential, state is pretty important to have, but there's not a lot of expectation for municipal business or freelancer filing options. So these may be features you either may want to defer to a later date or perhaps never build at all. So this is exactly what you want to take to your CEO and say, I need engineering dollars to build a perfectly functioning refund tracking feature because that is what my customers want, and I know that with precision here. So this should be the takeaway, if you will, for that conversation with your CEO. Almost done here, and we'll turn it over to Q&A. And then there's a couple other, and I'll be brief here, values to a conjoint. One of which is, I mentioned you can simulate preference shares for market share for any other combination. So this is obviously no longer in our tax example, but if you want to kind of see what combination of features relate to market share, even if they're not optimal or the most optimal, this is a very nimble approach that can be done. And then there's a lot that can be learned with respect to pricing, which is kind of a whole nother set of chapters. But one of the most immediately helpful is getting a clear signal on the trade-off between optimizing for market share versus revenue growth. And depending on the stage of growth you're in, there's very good reasons to choose one of those. But this tells you from a conjoint experiment what that trade-off is. So those are just two very lightweight appetizers of other applications of a conjoint that I can happy to discuss separately, but didn't want to underwhelm you with all of the potential value of a conjoint. So I hope you can see that the question around what to build doesn't need to be made after you've already built it and sold it. That is something that can and should, in my opinion, be known before you actually start investing real dollars in talent. So I'm just so grateful for the attention, the interest, and learning along with me. I know we're all curious learners here, so thank you so much for sharing this time together. I'm more than happy to chat about any product design or any strategy design questions you're facing or that keep you up at night. Feel free to email me at kyle@gradientmetrics.com. We will share this deck with you afterwards, so it's all in here. We've got a fun newsletter too that brings a little bit of levity and some quantitative rigor to your inbox if that combination is needed. And with that, I think we're right on time for the Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Kyle. We have a bunch of questions. The most upvoted question comes from Abrash. Would you recommend using one method over the other based on the maturity of the company? For example, qualitative research for early stage startups and trade-off experiments for more mature startups, say Series B+.
That's an excellent question. I think generally starting with qualitative research when you're just coming out of the gate is essential. You're gonna need to hear right from the mouth. I think that's where a lot of the inspirational product ideas originally can come from. You'll gather a lot of them qualitatively. So that's my recommendation early. And then once you've got a concept that's been formed through a lot of the qualitative listening you've been doing, then I think it starts to make sense to really kind of pull that apart and add some quantitative distinction once you've got a little more capital and are also starting to invest it in building. At that point, you're making some very big, expensive decisions, and using some quantitative precision to answer them would generally be my recommendation.
Awesome. The next question is from Suzanne. They ask, I work at a B2B on a very specific reporting product for a very specific industry. It may be difficult for users to imagine a different or alternative product given the specificity of the features we're trading off between. Are there other ways to frame the question for them?
Yeah, that is not an unfamiliar reality. And that's where expertise in survey design is going to be really, really helpful. So one potential way to go about that, this might seem like almost too direct, is to actually engage in what we call a respondent education experience, where as part of the survey, we kind of shake them a little, not literally, of course, just feel like the world is changing. We're going to show you some things you may have never contemplated that are are being designed to help you and your sector. So keep an open mind and try to make your preferences known, even if they're extremely aspirational. But if you see something that is of value to you, even if you can't imagine it existing today, that is what this exact kind of time together is designed to do. So we've done that a few times in those very, very kind of niche specific, almost cloistered sectors. And it does require getting the respondent into the right mindset. And that's very much a survey design question, but one that I think still makes the conjoint an equally valuable approach.
Great. The next question is from Tatiana. They ask, if your product is B2B, how do you account for the several user and customer personas whose preferences should inform prioritization together?
Yep, very good question. Hard to do. Hard to do. Typically, in that case, you will want to field the survey to a large enough sample of each of those potential buyers, because you're going to then need to know, and this is a bit more of a sales play, what the perceived value is from each of those kind of buying tiers or decision-making tiers. Even if they're ultimately all going to buy the same product, you will want to have a read on what, for example, the CFO's preferences are, even if they're very different from maybe like your frontline buyer, because you're going to be more armed with trying to sell and navigate that relationship, knowing what it is they're actually after. So it's a bit of a game, admittedly, even if the product you're ultimately selling and designing is going to be the same.
That's awesome. Jerga asks, if you're considering a feature that requires a big investment, how would you check if it's worth the investment? Currently, maybe you have some requests via customer support. Other competitors have it. There's a lot of enthusiasm around it internally, but no dedicated research around that feature.
Yeah, that's where a conjoint can be really helpful. So if you have a measure of the COG or the investment that would be required to build a feature, then you can model what the kind of potential payoff would be minus the investment that was required to actually build it. And because we collect a lot of actual value data via pricing from the conjoint, you're set up to answer that so long as you know roughly what the expected investment size is going to be.
Follow-up question for me, Kyle, just to go one step deeper on that. When you said calculate the investment, which factors do you typically recommend companies, include in that like calculation of investment? Is it just like engineering costs? Is it tool costs, time costs? What factors go into that?
I think those are all relevant, hard to estimate. But if you're making a very big decision, then I think casting a wide inclusive net in how you're calculating the size of that investment. So yeah, talent, engineering, tooling, even like potentially marketing, and the opportunity cost of like not focusing on other potential builds. Like I would be pretty inclusive in coming up with that figure.
Awesome. Next question is from Advaith. Sorry if I'm butchering your name there. Is this approach reliable when conducted with prospects versus customers?
It can be if designed correctly. I think there's two considerations there. One is, regardless of who you're trying to generalize to, you want to make sure that your sampling design is sound. So you can say with confidence, like, prospective customers as a whole prefer this, and current customers as a whole prefer that. So that's kind of condition one. And so baked into that is you need to have a large enough sample, and you need to have some assurances that they're generally randomly selected or not biased in a significant way. And then the other is one element that you can actually include as an attribute in a conjoint is brand. So this is a great way to actually measure the value of your brand or the value of your competitors' brands. So you can, include an attribute that's brand, and if it's tax products, like some of them may be branded, QuickBooks or TurboTax, others they're competitors. And so even for your prospective customers who may not be that familiar with your brand, it'll tell you what is valuable about your competitors that you may want to be aware of and consider as you design your own product and or marketing roadmap. But it does require like fielding them to two, distinct prospective and current customer audiences to draw that comparison.
Nice. Cool. All right, we have time for 2 more questions. The next, depending on how quick the answers are. So the next question is from Mark Tobin. Mark asks, for a conjoint experiment, how can you determine how large of a sample size you need?
Great, and that's something that should be evaluated as part of the attribute map design, because the determination of sample size is determined by the number of attributes and levels that you need to test. So we will run a power simulation to identify, based on X number of combination of attributes and levels, how many respondents we need to have to be confident that the model will actually converge and give us some precision. So that is a bit of a custom exercise, entirely dependent on kind of the breadth of the feature testing that needs to be done.
Excellent. Stevie has a clarification question. My understanding is that one uses MaxDiff to identify and or weigh the value of a specific product feature or spec on its own, whereas the conjoint can give you a precursor to an actual product or MVP that incorporates a combination of features and performance specs. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Excellent. Cool. For our last question, we have Kathy. She asks, can we use MaxDiff or conjoint analysis when evaluating attributes or pain point themes from early customer research? This is specific to an early stage startup assessing its pre-product market fit in a fairly new market.
Yeah. That's a fun application of these methods when you're trying to assess pain points. So it may be a little inverted thinking about it this way, but a MaxDiff can measure what do you prefer from most to least, kind of in the positive realm. But you could also invert that to be like, what do you hate the most? What is the biggest aggravation that you're facing in this sector or product space? And you'll still get a relative ranking and measure of size of what those biggest pain points are. So that is a very effective way to inform an initial concept. You're like, look, the pain is so severe because of these 2 contributing factors. So that is I think a clever way to measure pain points and inform your early stage roadmap.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for your time today, including you, Kyle. For more events from Reforge, just go to reforge.com/events. We pretty much have weekly events with experts like Kyle to bring the best product and growth expertise to you guys. Kyle, any last words of wisdom before we end the webinar here?
Simply that any kind of customer research is good research. Just know what you can claim from it and what you can't, but you should all be doing it. So I imagine you already are, but those are my final thoughts.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll send the recording out within 48 hours, along with a link to the newsletter that Kyle had mentioned and Kyle's artifact profile as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.